Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. As he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in Israel, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to prepare for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says: God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and your herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Good morning. This morning, as we ponder our Old Testament passage, I want to provide us with a different perspective of these verses. Oftentimes, Christians read through this passage and they go, "Oh my goodness, look at Joseph. Isn't that just an excellent basis for forgiveness?" Even upon my first reading of this particular passage during this study, it is undeniable that this is one of the things that jumps out of the pages quite plainly. Joseph's forgiveness here is quite clearly emulating the forgiveness that God has for us and the mercy that God provides us. However, that particular read-through, though important for us and for our formation as Christians, for our understanding of forgiveness, tends to skip some of the ick that's actually quite present throughout the entire story. A part of the reason we have such a positive view of Joseph is because Joseph is the focus. He's the main character of this narrative. However, this morning, I want us to come at this from a different perspective. And that perspective is not so that we can turn around and say, "Oh my goodness, Joseph sucks." But it's to give us a deeper insight into Scripture. The shift of perspective this morning will hopefully allow us to have a greater understanding, not only of how we are to forgive and treat each other, we're taught that often, but I hope this morning that it provides us with a greater understanding of how God forgives and treats us. And this is where I want to start. Judah is the fourth son of his father's first wife, the son of Leah the unloved. Judah is the fourth of 12 brothers. And Judah has been formed by dysfunctional relationships his entire life. He grows up learning that love has rankings. Jacob, Judah's father, doesn't merely love Rachel more than Leah. You see, that preference bleeds into the relationships Jacob has with his sons. In Genesis chapter 33, Judah would have been anywhere from the ages of 15 to 25. And this is the moment when Jacob's family is approaching Esau, who has 400 men with him, who Jacob is convinced that Esau still hates him and is there to extract revenge. Jacob has already divided his servants and sent them ahead, and at this point in time, he divides his wives and children also into 3 groups. The explanation for dividing his servants is so that if one group is attacked, the others can escape. And though this explanation is not given for why he divides his family, he divides his family like this, where his concubines and their sons go first. Leah and her children are second, and Rachel and her young son, Joseph, are third. Judah was clearly old enough to understand what was happening. Love has rankings in his family. And it's very clear that Judah knows where he stands in his father's eyes. And in this moment, when Joseph is probably just a young boy, the youngest of the 11 brothers so far, Judah knows where Joseph stands in his father's eyes. Judah grew up where love was ranked and he was middle on the totem pole. Judah grows up learning that relationships involve manipulation. He has so many clear-cut examples in his life, his father and his grandfather Laban in their toils back and forth with one another. His aunt Rachel steals the household gods when the family flees from what Judah would consider his homeland in the middle of the night. When Simeon and Levi, his older brothers, attack the city of Shechem on behalf of their sister who was wronged there, after their father had already declared the punishment. When Reuben goes into his father's concubine Bilhah to usurp power. When Joseph reports to Jacob a bad report about how his brothers are tending sheep. The manipulation had begun long before Judah was born, but it also continues on through Judah's life when the brothers deceive their father about Joseph and what happened to him. When Judah withholds his youngest son from his daughter-in-law Tamar because he was afraid. And when Tamar deceives Judah because he has failed in his obligations to his daughter-in-law. Judah understands that relationships must involve manipulation. And then, when he was in his late 30s, famine hits the land. And Judah and his brothers are sent by his father down to Egypt, where there is grain. And I paused and wondered what he must be thinking as he and his brothers walked down to the place where he knew he had sent the youngest of them. But upon arrival, this Egyptian official seems to come out of nowhere and accuse them of being spies. And no matter what they say, their honesty cannot convince this man that they are only there to buy grain. In fact, this official throws them into prison for 3 days with no evidence and no kind of escape plan. There's no end in sight. But on the 3rd day, this official comes and says to them, "The only way I'll believe your story is if you bring me your youngest brother." So the remaining brothers return home from Egypt without Simeon, who did not volunteer for this task, but was picked by this weird official. And Judah once again understands that love has rankings when his father already declares Simeon as lost, just as he declared Joseph as lost. And he refuses to let Benjamin go down to Egypt. And so the family maintains that for a time, but when the grain runs out again, it's Judah who stands up and ends up convincing his father to let Benjamin go back with them. They will receive nothing if they go back without Benjamin. And so Judah promises his father that whatever punishment he will accept if he does not bring Benjamin home. So upon the second arrival into Egypt, the brothers are escorted directly into the home of this Egyptian official. Terrified that this is the lead up to their execution due to things that had happened previously, they start questioning the steward of the household, who tells them that they are not in trouble, and in fact they are to enjoy a feast. And at this feast, Benjamin is lavished upon, getting 5 times as much as any brother. And the next day, they leave without worry, full of grain and wonderful things. But on their travel home, they are stopped once again by Egyptians. And this official's divination cup is found in Benjamin's bag. So they are hauled back to Egypt and put in front of this Egyptian official. And Judah and the brothers offer themselves as slaves together to work and serve together as one. But the official declares that he will only take the offender. That offender will be a slave in his household for the rest of their days. But Judah does something risky, and he approaches this official one-on-one and begs to take his brother's place, because Judah understands that love has rankings and that his father will recover from his loss, but not recover from the loss of Benjamin. And it's here that we find ourselves in the Old Testament this morning in chapter 45. This Egyptian official calls out for all of his servants to leave the room. And I imagine Judah's heart dropped, because having all of the attendants suddenly dismissed by a powerful and hostile ruler could very easily at that time be interpreted as a prelude to execution or imprisonment. The official dismissed all of the neutral witnesses in the room. And then I imagine the utter confusion that Judah must have felt when this official began to weep. And it was not quiet crying, it was loud, to the point where those who had exited the room could hear and were so disturbed that they went and told Pharaoh about it. I imagine a lot of snot mixed into this. Bubbling, bumbling, crying. And still distraught, Joseph cries out his identity and asks if his father is still alive. I wonder what went through Judah's mind first. Was his first thought, how am I going to tell my father about what I did? Because here's the evidence. Joseph's alive. Or perhaps was his first thought, this is how I die, at the hands of the brother that I sold. We don't know. What we do know is that collectively the brothers were not too happy to see Joseph. They're absolutely terrified, and they should be, considering all that they had just gone through. But Joseph, despite the fact that he lived into the manipulation of his family, does something uncharacteristic. He provides forgiveness. And we know that this forgiveness is actually quite true and genuine because we get to read farther. It's Christ-like forgiveness. Joseph doesn't later on lord their mistakes over them. He doesn't say, "Do you remember when?" He doesn't just tolerate the presence of his brothers. He gives them the best. Every single brother is extended the same forgiveness, mercy, and grace from Benjamin to Reuben. And it is not until Joseph kisses each of his brothers and weeps over them that the brothers begin to feel something other than fear. Next week, our lectionary jumps to Exodus, so I'm confident in bringing up this Genesis chapter 50, because something becomes abundantly clear here. Jacob dies. Their father dies in Egypt. And all of the brothers, because scripture does not exclude Benjamin from this group, become increasingly afraid that now that their father is gone, Joseph is going to get us. And they once again choose manipulation in this moment, sending a message to Joseph from their father that never actually happened, to try and maintain Joseph's forgiveness. But Joseph has already forgiven them. And not only that, Joseph has provided for them, and not just enough to get by, he has provided the best. He has searched Egypt and given them the best land and everything that they could want or need. There's security that Joseph provided them. And years have passed in that security, in that forgiveness. All of the brothers have been living inside Joseph's forgiveness, and yet they still don't trust it. They believe that Joseph's forgiveness is conditional. They believe that Joseph's forgiveness hinges upon the life of their father. That they've not really been forgiven, they've been spared momentarily. And how many times do we as Christians do the same thing with God? How many times do we come before the throne, we ask for forgiveness, we know the verses we're supposed to say, we have the head knowledge about grace, and we know, and we believe that Christ died for us, and we know up here that we're forgiven. But somewhere underneath it all, we don't believe it. We don't believe that God can forgive our struggles. We don't believe that God can forgive the things that we find ourselves addicted to. We don't believe that God can forgive the things that we think are just so big. How many times are we as Christians sitting in Egypt experiencing the wonders and grace of forgiveness, while at the same time wondering if Joseph is finally going to punish us? And the message could stop here. It could stop here with, do you believe the forgiveness that you have received? But I don't want to stop here quite yet. I want us to jump ahead to just under 2,000 years later, where we find ourselves in Matthew chapter 15. We find here Jesus, according to Matthew, a descendant of Judah and Tamar. And in this passage, Jesus has traveled outside of Palestine. It is said he withdrew, and scholars believe that it was to prepare himself for ultimately what's coming. Because this place that he picked to stay, the priests and Pharisees were unlikely to follow him here. it was supposed to be quiet. But a Canaanite woman approaches Jesus here, and her daughter is possessed with a demon. And she cries out, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David." And this interaction is interesting because Jesus doesn't respond to her. But she keeps following and keeps persisting and keeps crying out, almost like she's taking his silence for permission. And finally, the disciples, fed up with what's going on, approach Jesus and they say, "Hey, she's pretty annoying. Can you send her away, please?" And Jesus says to the disciples, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." And that's his answer to them. And I find that line particularly stumbling because back in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus heals a servant of a centurion. But perhaps because that interaction happens in Palestine, it was okay. But Jesus says this line to the disciples and not to this Canaanite woman. And it seems directly after that, this woman comes and kneels before Jesus and says, "Lord, help me." And Jesus' response here is even more confusing than the line before it. He says to this woman, "It is not right to take children's bread and toss it to the dogs." It's most certainly not a kind thing to say to someone, but it's also an analogy. In our English translation, kind of makes it sound a little more harsh than it was intended to be. Because this particular word for dog here, in ancient times, dogs were compared to rats, except for the dogs that they considered pets that lived in someone's home. And it is this Greek word for pet that Jesus uses instead of parasite, which would have been street dogs. But house dogs and pets were companions. And they would come through and clean up the scraps of food that had been left behind by the family. The woman's response to Jesus' statement, which is almost like a pun in itself because Jesus laid out a little bread trail for her to scoop up, she says to him, "Okay, but even pet dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the table." And with this one line, Jesus says, "Woman, you have great faith," and her request is granted. Her daughter is healed immediately. It's such a weird passage. It's bizarre and it can be uncomfortable to read. It feels almost cruel and uncharacteristic. But I want us to be able to pull a couple of things out. Jesus knows who this woman is. And almost in contrast to the woman at the well, Jesus doesn't have to lay out this woman's past for her to believe. He doesn't interrogate her on anything. He doesn't try to establish whether or not she's sufficiently moral. He doesn't convert her to Judaism. Jesus, in his own words, was sent to Israel, but he doesn't make her become part of Israel before mercy becomes available to her. And then, once her daughter's healed, there's no trick afterwards. There's no holding the miracle over her head to get something in return. There's no cup planted in her daughter's belongings. There's no second test that this woman must complete. There's no, "Let me see if you really mean what you say." Her daughter is just healed. There's no moral prerequisite. There's no manipulation involved at all. There is just Jesus, who is moved by the faith of a mother, just as Jesus was moved by the faith of a centurion, just as Jesus was moved by the faith of those who brought a paralyzed man to him, just as Jesus was moved by the faith of the woman who had been bleeding, who reached out to touch his cloak, Just as Jesus was moved by the faith of the blind men who called out to him on the side of the road, "Son of David, have mercy." Jesus' character is consistent. You see, in the Old Testament, Joseph is merciful towards his brothers. Joseph is forgiving towards his brothers. Joseph acts towards his brothers the way Jesus calls us to act and behave towards one another. But Joseph is also human. He has a past with these people. His forgiveness points towards Christ, but Joseph is not Christ. Joseph's mercy comes through this complicated mess of human relationship, trauma, uncertainty, testing, fear, and mistrust. Judah lives through this complication. Judah lives in forgiveness without believing that it's true because of this complication. Jesus shows us something better. The problem for Judah and his brothers is that their experience of life, through that they've learned that human relationships and forgiveness aren't always trustworthy. They learn that love is ranked and that relationships are manipulation waiting to happen. And if that's your philosophy on life, how can you live in someone's forgiveness without always wondering whether the other shoe is going to drop? How many times have we in our own lives sat in forgiveness when someone says, "I forgive you," and then 6 months later they say, "Remember when you did that?" How many times do we sit in forgiveness when someone tells us, "Oh no, it's okay," until when the very next argument comes up, they throw it back in our faces? How many times do we sit in forgiveness when someone tells us, "Don't worry about it, I've moved on," until they're angry enough to reach backwards and retrieve the thing that they said they released? Our life experiences teach us that forgiveness has an expiration date. Our life experiences teach us that mercy has conditions. Our experience teach us that grace, that the favoritism that we're supposed to have, the favor that we are shown, has a fine print written underneath. And because of our learned experiences, we project all that junk onto God. We have learned from our relationships here, even the best ones that we have, to distrust forgiveness. But God's mercy does not have the same character as human mercy. And that's because God's mercy flows from the trustworthy character of Christ. So I want to ask you this morning, do you actually believe that you are forgiven? Because there's a difference between knowing the doctrine of forgiveness, which I think we're all really good at. Most Christians are really good at knowing we are forgiven. But do we live like a person in forgiveness? Judah and his brothers were absolutely forgiven. They were provided for, they were welcomed, they were safe, and we have the ability to read that story and understand the depths of that forgiveness. But it seems that they spent most of their lives waiting for a punishment that they expected. Judah learned that love had rankings, that relationships involve manipulation of some kind. And that leads him to believe that forgiveness will have conditions tied to it. But Jesus reveals to us that God's mercy isn't governed by any of those things. This morning, our question is not whether you know that God forgives, because we know God does. The question is whether we trust in the forgiveness that it has already been given to us. Are we sitting in Egypt, surrounded by the evidence of God's mercy, and are still waiting for the punishment that's to come? I assure you, the character of Christ is trustworthy. And when Christ extends mercy, we don't have to spend the rest of our lives wondering when the other shoe is going to drop. We are a forgiven people. So it's time to start believing it.